Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. We are diving into something really fascinating today.
Yeah.
And it's a topic that you've asked us to explore, actually.
Cool. Okay.
And it's about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
Yeah.
And specifically his lineage and kind of the religious landscape that existed before the advent of Islam.
Yeah, that's right.
Um, and so, you sent us a transcript of a really, really interesting YouTube video by Dr. Othman Alchemies.
Yeah.
And he's really diving deep into the story of the Prophet Ismail, peace be upon him.
Yeah.
So we thought, okay, well, this is great. This is a great place for us to kind of begin this deep dive.
It really is.
And because the goal really is to kind of trace those threads that connect the Prophet Ismail to the early Arab traditions in Mecca, and then eventually how that leads up to the arrival of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
That's it.
And I know you've always had this kind of fascination with the roots of all of this.
I do. I really do.
The historical and religious kind of background. So we're really excited to kind of get into this with you.
No,
Yeah.
I'm really happy to be here and kind of go through this together and see what the transcript, tells us, because it really does offer some really fascinating insights into this whole narrative.
Yeah, definitely. So let's just start right at the beginning.
Yeah.
And the transcript sort of starts with the children of Abraham, right? The Prophet Abraham, peace be upon him.
Yes.
And it mentions that there's accounts of, more than just two,
Yeah.
but that the two most well-known children are
Isaac and Ishmael.
Isaac and Ishmael, exactly.
Yes.
Peace be upon them.
Yeah.
And for the purposes of today's deep dive, we're really concentrating on Ishmael.
Right.
Because it's his lineage that leads to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
Precisely. Yeah. Both are of course, pivotal figures, no doubt about it.
Yeah.
But for understanding the context of this early Arab traditions and of course, the arrival of Islam, the line through Ishmael is key. And the transcript brings up a really important verse from the Quran that speaks to Ishmael's status.
Yeah, absolutely. It brings up Surah Maryam.
Yeah.
And God says this beautiful thing about the Prophet Ismail, peace be upon him.
Yeah.
And mentioned in the book, Ishmael, indeed, he was truthful in his promise, and he was a messenger and a prophet. And he used to enjoin on his people prayer and charity, and he was to his Lord pleasing.
Yeah, it really is beautiful, and it really, underscores just how highly regarded he was.
Yeah, it's really powerful.
And, if we look broader, within the Islamic tradition,
Yeah.
Prophet Ishmael is not just a prophet in a general sense, but he's widely believed to have been specifically sent as a messenger and a prophet to the Arab people.
Oh, interesting.
And this gives his role, particular significance, I think, for the region that we're talking about. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's a huge point.
Yeah.
And it kind of leads us to what I think is so fascinating about all of this, which is, we see these traces of his teachings, centuries later, evident in Mecca before, Islam even came about.
Yep.
And the transcript goes into, quite a bit of detail about, specific practices among the pre-Islamic Arabs that really echo, the Prophet Ismail's way of life, his deen.
Yeah, it's a deen.
And just for everyone, listening, when we talk about deen, we're talking about this way of life.
Yeah, whole system.
It's ordained by God, and it includes beliefs and practices, moral principles. All of that, encompasses deen.
It does, and you see that reflected in the practices that the transcript talks about. So
Right. So, for example, it talks about the Hajj pilgrimage,
Yeah.
and the circumambulation of the Kaaba, the tawaf. The standing at Arafah, the stay at Muzdalifah.
Right. What's fascinating, about these is that these rituals are so resilient. Despite the passage of, centuries and some pretty significant alterations to the original monotheistic practices, right? You still see that fundamental structure of the Hajj remaining.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's interesting because the transcript points out that while the Quraysh tribe,
Yeah.
who are the guardians of the Kaaba at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him,
Yeah.
they didn't participate in the standing at Arafah.
Yeah.
But other Arab globes did.
Really?
Yeah, so it's fascinating to think about that.
Yeah, I mean, what do you think it is about these specific rituals that, they held on even though there was this polytheistic kind of overlay?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
Maybe it speaks to this deeply ingrained sense of tradition, and the sanctity that was associated with these acts.
Yeah.
Even if the original meaning had become somewhat obscured over time.
Right. I mean, it's like the action itself had this power, even if
Yeah, perhaps, yeah.
the full understanding wasn't there.
Yeah, and the transcript also mentions, The rituals of Sai,
Right.
the walking back and forth between the hills of Safa and Marwa.
Yeah, yeah.
And all these elements, really strongly suggest this link back to the Prophet Ismail's original deen.
Yeah, yeah. It's so interesting.
But, as the transcript also makes clear,
Yeah.
there were some significant departures,
Yeah.
from that original monotheism.
Oh, absolutely. And that's something we really have to kind of dig into, because it's it's one thing to say that the core of it remained, but it's almost more interesting to think about where things diverged and how that happened.
Well, and how stark the contrast is, right?
Yeah.
We think about these sacred spaces,
Yeah.
originally meant for the worship of, one God,
Yeah.
and then becoming, filled with idols.
Yeah.
And then the ways in which worship itself changed. The
Wow.
transcript talks about, these non-religious activities during the tawaf,
Right.
like singing and clapping and even whistling.
Oh, wow.
It really paints this picture of a tradition that had in many ways lost its original focus.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So we have these remnants of the Prophet Ismail's teachings,
Yeah.
but we also have this introduction of idols.
Right.
So how does the transcript kind of explain this shift towards, this polytheism?
Well, the transcript actually highlights a very specific historical account.
Yeah.
For the introduction of idols, it mentions Amr ibn Luhai al-Khuzai
Yeah.
from the Khuzai tribe, who actually held power in Mecca before the Quraysh.
Okay.
And he's reported to have been the first to bring idols into Mecca from Jeddah.
Oh, wow.
And subsequently, the worship of these idols spread among the Arab tribes.
That's wild.
It is wild. It makes you think about how often, power structures and shifts and cultural influence lead to this syncretism
Yeah.
of religious practices.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point.
The story of Amr ibn Luhai highlights how a single individual
Yeah.
can significantly alter a religious landscape.
That's true.
And we see that repeated throughout history.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. But even with these deviations, right? The fact that the core rituals like the Hajj and this reverence for the Kaaba persisted, it does suggest that, that connection to Prophet Ismail's tradition wasn't entirely broken.
Right.
And this brings us to, the evidence suggesting that in some ways, the Arabs were still following the Prophet Ismail's deen.
Yeah.
And the transcript mentions that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, before his prophethood, was a Hanif.
Yes, this is a really pivotal point.
Yeah.
The term Hanif refers to someone who would adhere to the pure monotheism of the Prophet Abraham, peace be upon him.
Yeah.
And by extension, Prophet Ishmael, right before the specific revelations of Islam.
Right.
And the transcript notes that his worship in the cave of Hira was in accordance with the Millat Ibrahim.
Yeah.
The way of Abraham.
Yeah.
And the deen of the Prophet Ismail.
Yeah. So essentially, even before receiving revelation, he had this kind of inherent understanding of monotheism.
He did.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the transcript also clarifies that while the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had this understanding of the oneness of God and the falsehood of idol worship.
Right.
The fitra.
Yeah.
He wasn't aware of all the specific details, right?
Yeah.
The Kafas Sharia,
right.
Of the religious law before he received the divine revelation.
Right. And when we say Tafazil al-Sharia, we mean, those specific rulings and regulations.
Yeah.
Of the, divinely ordained law.
Exactly. Yeah. And then the Quranic verse mentioned, and he found you lost and guided you. Yeah. It's interesting how that's interpreted here, because it's not seen as referring to a state of disbelief.
Right.
It's this lack of detailed knowledge, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Specific laws.
Yeah. It's so interesting because it's like there's this core belief that is there.
Yes.
But there isn't, like you said, the details yet.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a subtle but crucial distinction.
Absolutely.
It really highlights the continuity of this core monotheistic belief.
Yeah.
Alongside a lack of a detailed legal understanding.
Yeah, and then discussion moves to this idea of, the importance of monotheism, right? And it brings in these really impactful examples, like the story of Abdullah ibn Jun, who was known for just this incredible generosity towards pilgrims.
Yes.
But he's informed that all of these good deeds that he's doing aren't going to benefit him in the afterlife because he didn't affirm monotheism.
That's a really powerful illustration.
It's really powerful.
It really underscores the the foundational nature of belief in one God.
Yeah.
In the Islamic tradition,
Yeah.
The Prophet's statement about Abdullah ibn Judan not saying, Rabbi Gafirli katiyati yamadin,
Yeah.
my Lord, forgive me my sins on the day of judgment.
Yeah.
Emphasizes that while good actions are, important,
Yeah.
they're not sufficient without that core affirmation,
Yeah, and it's really interesting too because it talks about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, but talking about his own father
Yeah.
and the father of the man who's asking him this question, and how they're both going to be in the fire because of
Yes.
the disbelief.
Yes.
And it's just such a stark reminder of the accountability before God.
Yeah.
Right? And that your familial connections
Don't matter.
They don't matter. They don't supersede this principle of faith.
That's right.
And then it goes on to give other examples like, the wife of Prophet Lut, peace be upon him.
Yeah.
The son of the Prophet Noah, peace be upon him.
Yeah.
The father of Abraham, peace be upon him, Azar.
Yeah.
And all of them being in the fire because of their disbelief.
It really reinforces that central tenet, across all these prophetic traditions.
Yeah.
And really highlights a universal principle.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this leads, naturally to the discussion about the obligation for the people of Mecca, right?
Yeah.
To adhere to the deen of the Prophet Ismail.
Right, and then it mentions, this incident of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, weeping at his mother's grave.
Yes.
During the journey to Hudaybiyah.
Yeah.
And he's granted permission to visit the grave.
Yes.
But not to seek forgiveness for her.
Right.
And that, again, underscores the paramount importance of faith.
Absolutely. And the transcript clarifies that the people of Mecca were accountable to the deen and the Sharia of the Prophet Ismail.
Yeah.
But they had largely deviated from it.
Right.
And it's noteworthy that the transcript mentions people like Zayd ibn Amr ibn Nufail as examples of those who, even amidst this widespread polytheism, remain steadfast in their belief, adhering to the deen of Prophet Ismail.
It's amazing.
They recognize the truth.
Yeah.
Even though it wasn't the prevailing societal norm.
Yeah, they were holding on to that core truth.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that brings us, to the direct lineage, right?
Yeah.
The transcript states, unequivocally that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the only prophet from the lineage of Prophet Ismail, peace be upon him.
Yeah.
And the final prophet, of course.
Yeah.
And it also includes this really powerful statement, from the prophet himself.
Yeah.
Where he confirms this lineage and he says, Allah chose Quraysh from the Arabs, chose Banu Hashim from Quraysh, and chose me from Banu Hashim, so I am the best of the best of the best.
It's a very clear declaration,
It is.
And really significant, in terms of establishing his place within this prophetic lineage.
Absolutely.
And the Quranic reference to the Prophet Abraham, peace be upon him, as the father.
Yeah.
In terms of faith.
Right.
Millata abikum Ibrahim.
Yeah.
Is also crucial.
Yeah.
Because it highlights, that spiritual connection.
Right.
Right. But also affirms, the physical descent.
Yeah.
Through the Prophet Ismail.
Yeah.
Which is the consensus, among Islamic scholars.
Yeah, and then the transcript kind of goes off into this broader genealogical kind of discussion.
Yeah.
It talks about, the Arabs being, kind of divided into these two lineages.
Yeah, Adnan and Qatan.
Adnan and Qatan, exactly.
Yeah.
And clarifies that, scholars generally agree that the Adnan lineage, from whom the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, descends, are the descendants of the Prophet Ismail. But there are differing opinions about the Qatan lineage.
That's right.
So it gets kind of complicated there.
It does.
But I think it's important for us to kind of, dig into that a little bit.
Yeah, I think so too.
To really kind of understand, the scope of Prophet Ismail's influence.
Yeah.
So what's the prevailing view on the Qatan lineage? Because
so the prevailing scholarly view is that the Qatan lineage, which includes the tribe of Yuham,
right,
which is the tribe that the Prophet Ismail, peace be upon him, married into,
right,
are not direct paternal descendants of Prophet Ismail.
Okay.
However, their connection
and
their shared ancestry is acknowledged.
Right.
Through the marital bond and broader historical relationships.
Right. So there's this connection, but it's not necessarily a direct paternal lineage.
Yeah, and this is where that hadith about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, encouraging the tribe of Bani Aslam,
right,
comes into play.
In archery.
Yes, in archery, he says, shoot children of so-and-so for your father. Ismail was an archer, and I am with you.
Yeah.
Right? And Bani Aslam were a part of the Khuzai,
Right.
which belongs to the Khatan lineage.
Right.
And so the transcript explains that, this reference to Ismail as their father, in this context, is likely a reference to that maternal connection.
Yeah.
Grandfather through marriage.
Okay.
Rather than a direct, paternal lineage.
That makes sense.
Yeah. It's a subtle distinction.
Yeah.
But an important one when we're trying to understand these historical relationships.
Absolutely. And I think the analogy that the transcript uses is really helpful. It talks about the descendants of Fatima.
Yeah.
May Allah be pleased with her.
Yeah.
Being referred to as the children of the Prophet, peace be upon him,
right.
despite the fact that their direct lineage is through Ali, may Allah be pleased with him.
Right.
So it's this idea that there's this connection that's really strong and really important, even if it's not strictly, paternal.
It's a nuance that highlights, this web of tribal connections, and the respect, for that shared history.
Yeah.
Even when the direct lineage isn't, the primary link.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And finally, the deep dive touches on this really fascinating topic of the prophecy of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in other religious scriptures, specifically referencing the Torah, Isaiah chapter 42.
Yes.
And the interpretation that's presented here is suggesting that these verses do contain a prophecy about the coming of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
Right. And what's particularly interesting here is the mention of Kedar.
Right.
Sometimes, spelled Kedar.
Yeah.
Who's identified in Genesis 25 as one of the sons of the Prophet Ismail.
Right.
And the prophecy is linked to the land inhabited by the descendants of Kedar.
Right.
And also references Selah.
Yeah.
Which is believed to be, a mountain in the vicinity of Medina.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So,
and then it talks about the verses themselves, right?
Yeah.
And how they describe things like, bringing forth justice, guiding the blind,
right.
Making darkness light,
right.
straightening the crooked paths, and even this criticism of those who, trust in carved images.
Yes.
Which echoes those pre-Islamic practices in Mecca.
Yeah, it does.
That we talked about earlier.
Yeah, and the transcript concludes this point by stating that this is, within Islamic tradition, understood as a prophecy. Yeah. Foretelling the arrival of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
Right.
Found within their own scriptures.
Yeah, it's so interesting how you see these connections.
It is.
Not just in the historical lineage. Yeah. But even going back to these scriptures.
It is. Yeah, and it adds another layer to understanding his coming.
Yeah.
Within the context of these previous monotheistic traditions.
Absolutely.
And their expectations.
Yeah. So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, I mean, we've really journeyed, through these historical connections between Prophet Ismail, peace be upon him, and the early Arab traditions in Mecca.
Well, yeah.
We've seen how those monotheistic roots persisted in practices like the Hajj, even when, there was idol worship happening.
Yeah.
And we've explored, this very clear lineage of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as a descendant of Prophet Ismail.
Oh, absolutely.
And even touched upon, these potential prophecies of his arrival in other religious texts.
Yeah, it's a rich and interconnected story.
It really is. It's amazing how it all kind of comes together.
And I think if we connect this back to, the bigger picture. Understanding these historical and religious links really provides a deeper appreciation, for the continuity, of monotheistic thought.
Yeah.
And the context in which Islam emerged.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a huge takeaway.
Yeah.
And I think it really makes you consider how these different faiths and cultures have interacted and evolved, over time.
It does.
So what further questions does this spark for you, listener, about this interplay of history and lineage and faith? I mean, it's definitely something to keep thinking about.
Yeah, it is.
So thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Of course.
We'll see you next time.